Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome back to Sea Power Naval Combat in the Missile Age. Today's video is all going to be about the subject of EMCON, or Emission Control. And we're going to be exploring the perfect mission scenario to explain why it's generally a good idea to keep your sensors off in order to not give away your position unintentionally, but not always. This is the Dong Hoi scenario. It's set in 1972. It's a Vietnam War scenario. Surface Action Group Oklahoma has been tasked with a surface bombardment mission. This was a fairly common activity performed by the US Navy during the Vietnam War. They would sail up and down the coast of North Vietnam, shooting up railway lines, fuel facilities, basically anything of military significance. So, primary objective: sail along the coast and destroy any large installations like docks and fuel depots encountered. Guided missile cruiser, the USS Sterett, is on station to the northeast to provide air cover. This mission also comes with a threat report. Intelligence suspects targets defended by several coastal artillery sites. Warning yellow, do not fire unless fired upon. EMCON, maintain radio silence until otherwise directed. So, we've talked about EMCON briefly in previous videos, but some people do still appear to be a little bit confused about why you should and shouldn't turn your radars on. If it helps, imagine that you're searching for somebody at night and you have a flashlight. Now, if you turn that flashlight on and that person's within 20 to 50 meters away, you're going to see them, assuming you point the flashlight in the right direction. But if they're any further away than that, you won't see them, but they'll see your flashlight. They may not necessarily know exactly where you are, but they'll know which way you are, and they'll have a pretty good idea of how far away you are. Now, in the world of electronic warfare, things are obviously a little bit more complicated than that, because not all radars are the same. There's a big difference between a navigation radar, which most vessels have, and things like a fire control radar, or an air search or surface search radar. And an electronic warfare operator will not only know that a radar has been turned on, but they'll be able to identify the type of radar. And if they can identify the type of radar, they know what type of vessel carries it. So turning your radars on gives away all kinds of useful information to the enemy. So don't turn your radar on unless you need to? Well, yes and no. For now though, we're going to follow our EMCON policy and we're not going to turn our radars on as directed in the mission briefing, and we're going to see what happens. Now, we have visually spotted a pair of fast attack torpedo boats. So the USS Sterett, because the radar isn't on, is engaging with guns. The USS Sterett is armed with missiles that could comfortably take this threat out long before they get to within torpedo launch range. But in order to do that, it will have to turn its radars on, because the missiles are radar guided. So with no radar, you've got no missiles. Now would actually be an extremely good time to turn our surface search radars on, because they know we're here anyway. We're already under attack. However, just to continue the example, we'll maintain mission control, because there is a bigger threat. Because we don't have our radars on, we don't know it's coming. You see, the threat posed by North Vietnam to our surface action group in this particular scenario is not limited to just torpedo boats. North Vietnam also has an air force, and with no air search radars on, we're not going to detect them until they get within visual range, at which point they're too close for missiles. MiG-17s spotted with the old Mark 1 eyeball at a range of about 5 miles, armed with what looks like a pair of 500-pound bombs. So, extremely low tech, but that doesn't mean ineffective, because a pair of 500-pound bombs can make an awful mess of the Gearing-class destroyers, the USS Lloyd Thomas and the USS Higbee, which are escorting the USS Oklahoma City. Now remember, the USS Sterett, which is a Belknap-class guided missile cruiser, is stationed to the northeast to provide air cover, but it can't provide air cover if it doesn't have its radars turned on, which is a fairly solid argument against maintaining EMCON. A little bit too late for our two gearings though. Bombs away, and the Lloyd Thomas is hit by 1,000 pounds of high explosives. Now the USS Higbee. She's manoeuvring, trying to hit the MiG-17 with a 5-inch gun, with fairly predictable results, and she's already sinking. The Lloyd Thomas, not sinking yet, but, well, hasn't sunk yet, but is definitely sinking. So, the scenario's only just started. We've already lost half of our force because we followed orders and we maintained emission control. But Jingles, your rules of engagement stated that you weren't allowed to fire anyway, unless fired upon. Depends how you define fired upon though, doesn't it? Plus, we are here to destroy surface installations, factories, fuel depots. I mean, they're not going to fire upon us, and we have to shoot at them. So there's a bit of wiggle room in the details here. I mean, the whole do not fire unless fired upon thing is, let's just say it's open to interpretation. And we're going to explore that further and talk a bit more about EMCON and why it's not always a great idea, although hopefully you've already seen that, by restarting the scenario. And this time we're going to redo it, except we're going to apply large amounts of common sense. So, restart of the scenario. The first thing you should always do is pause and have a look at the capabilities of the forces under your command. This is the USS Oklahoma. It's a Galveston-class missile cruiser. The Galvestons were Cleveland-class light cruisers who had most of their 6-inch guns removed and instead were fitted with RIM 8 Talos missiles, which have a 130 nautical mile range, but a 3.5 nautical mile minimum range. So if you wait until you can see the MiG-17s, they're already too close to shoot down. Next up, the USS Sterett, our air cover. It's a Belknap-class missile cruiser, and it's armed with a RIM 2F, which also has a 3.5 nautical mile minimum range, but a 40 nautical mile maximum range. Note that both of these missiles also have an anti-surface capability. The other two ships in the force, the USS Lloyd Thomas and the USS Higbee, are World War II vintage Gearing-class destroyers, although in the 1960s, the US Navy undertook a program known as FRAM, Fleet Rehabilitation and Maintenance, to upgrade and modernize their World War II vintage destroyers like the Gearings and the Allen M. Sumners. Generally, however, this usually just involved giving them better sonar, turning them into more effective submarine hunters rather than enhancing their anti-air capabilities. Which means that they're not going to be a huge amount of use for us in this scenario. They retain all of their 5-inch guns, but they don't have any missile systems. Well, actually, not all of the FRAM 1 and 2 Gearings retained all of their 5-inch guns. In all cases, they had at least one turret removed in order to provide space for a flight deck. That doesn't mean they gave them helicopters, though. In fact, only one ship in this force, the USS Sterett, the Belknap-class guided missile cruiser, actually has a helicopter. The others all have flight decks, but they don't have helicopters of their own. So now that we know what forces we have under our command and we understand what their actual capabilities are, I'm going to start turning my radars on. You see, the argument in favour of maintaining EMCON and keeping your radars off is that it doesn't compromise your location unnecessarily, and that's a good argument. But even though we've already played through this scenario once and know that we've been compromised anyway, even if we didn't know that, there are still arguments in favour of turning your radars on anyway. It all comes down to whatever the threat is that you're facing. This is the US Navy versus North Vietnam. What exactly is the worst that they can do? What's the worst possible consequence of your going radar active, given the threat that you're facing? Because if you understand what the threat is, then you can make that kind of judgment. It's North Vietnam. They didn't have surface-to-surface missiles. They didn't have air-to-surface missiles. They didn't have any kind of standoff weapons. These torpedo boats, for example, we've spotted them visually, so we know exactly what they are, so we can pull up the unit reference card and see what it is that they're armed with, so we understand the threat. These are P6 torpedo boats. They've got 25mm guns and 53, 56 torpedoes. These are unguided torpedoes. They're not even wake-homing or wire-guided, and they have a maximum range of 4.5 nautical miles. So the threat posed by these things can basically be summarised as, fine, come at me, bro. At the same time, though, you don't want to just let them get to within 4.5 nautical miles, and, I mean, I could take them out with the Sterett's guns, but they are small, fast-moving targets, And I've got 40 of these missiles, and, well, it's not my money, is it? So, missiles away. So the game is still paused, but because we do now have all of our radars on, we now get a much, much better picture of exactly what's lying in wait for us over here. So this is our surface search radar return, and we're probably looking at an airbase or a fuel depot. So that's one of our primary targets. Now we know exactly where it is. But hang on a minute, there's something extremely suspicious occurring to the south of our primary target. Whatever that is, it has its radar active, and we can tell by the type of radar that it's a military aircraft. Also, the fact that it's flying at more than 450 knots is a bit of a giveaway. So I'm going to go ahead and classify that as hostile, and this, and yeah, there's another one over there. They're all flying straight towards us, and they're all doing 450 knots. Now remember our rules of engagement, we're not supposed to fire unless fired upon. Depends how you define fired upon though, because you don't have to actually fire a weapon at somebody to commit a hostile act. If you wait for a MiG-17 to actually get to within 500 meters and drop its bombs to actually fire upon you, you've probably left it a little bit too late. You see, this is where the wiggle room comes in. There's a lot of room for interpretation in what actually constitutes a hostile act, and what those MiG-17s are doing, because I know they're the MiG-17s, because I've already begun this scenario once, but even if I didn't know exactly what they were, they are committing a hostile act, because they are clearly, based on their radar and speed, military aircraft, and they are flying what is known as an attack profile. They're coming right at us. That is a hostile act, and that's good enough for me.
7009.
Meanwhile, I'm getting the Sterret's Helo airborne because I'm not convinced that those two P6 torpedo boats are the only surface threat. And while the Helo is getting airborne, I'm just assigning targets to anybody else who actually has the range to start shooting. But we definitely don't want to let these guys get to within 4.5 nautical miles, so the Sterret should probably focus on them first. Now at the moment we are weapons tight, which means that providing you have your tracking radars turned on and your air search radars, your force will defend themselves from incoming missiles. But you do still have to manually designate surface or other air targets for them, which is what I'm doing here. Your alternatives to weapons tight are weapons hold, which you're almost never going to use because it basically just means that you refuse to fire anything at anything, or weapons free. Weapons free isn't necessarily the Wild West scenario that a lot of people seem to think it is. You won't just suddenly start blazing away at every neutral or unidentified contact, but when you go weapons free, your force will, on its own initiative, start prioritising, sorting and engaging only those targets that have already been classified as hostile. So I could stay weapons tight and continue designating targets individually, which will obviously give you a greater degree of control over what unfolds, or you could just trust the professionals, go weapons free, and providing you have correctly identified everything that is hostile as hostile, and you haven't made any oopsies, you can just sit back and let the professionals do what they're paid to do. These RIM-8 missiles are absolutely huge, by the way. They were 7,800 pound missiles, and more than half of the missile's mass was made up by the first stage booster, which would get these things up to a speed of Mach 3. They had a 465 pound warhead, which, packed a fairly serious punch. But they could also be armed with nukes, 2 to 5 kiloton warheads. That's not the case in this scenario, obviously. Unsurprisingly, the MiG-17s have been prioritised as the biggest threat. That's Splash 1, and that's Splash 2. Look at the speed of these missiles. I mean, they're in the glide phase now, but they're still doing over 1,000 knots. And that's Splash 3. And that wasn't even the RIM-8 from the Sterret, those were the RIM-2X from the Oklahoma City. So that's all three of the MiGs taken care of. There's no more air threat, well, at least not yet. And one of the PT boats has already been taken down by the Sterret. And there's a missile on the way from the Oklahoma to take care of that one too. It's obviously already being engaged by the Sterret's guns, although not particularly successfully, and it is getting a little close enough to use its 25mm, oh never mind. Oh well, thanks for turning up. So, now we're free to get on with the job that we're actually here to do, and pummel those ground targets. This all actually happened during the Vietnam War. The US Navy called it Operation Sea Dragon. It was a series of bombardment missions that began in October 1966 and continued, well, this scenario was set in 1972 and they were still doing it then. It wasn't all just the US Navy though. The Royal Australian Navy also took part in Operation Sea Dragon. The 3 Perth-class guided missile destroyers, the Perth, the Brisbane and the Hobart, and the Daring-class destroyer, HMAS Vendetta, all took part in these operations. In reality, they didn't use expensive missiles, they mostly did it with gun bombardment. Which is what I could be doing here, but that would get my force within range of the coastal defence batteries. And why would I want to do that? I mean, yeah, missiles are expensive, but it's not my money, is it? Can take out their radar too, and then we can get close enough to start bombarding them with the 6-inch guns. Because the coastal artillery can fire over open sights, but without radar they're a lot less accurate. And those 2 PT-6s weren't the only surface threat attacking the Sterret. And of course we wouldn't have seen this one coming if we hadn't turned our surface search radar. You see, when the threat is as trivial as this, when they literally have to get to within suicide range to actually be able to hurt you, regardless of what your EMCON policy is, you're not actually giving anything up by turning the radars on. It's a cost-benefit analysis. If the cost of turning your radars on, or your sonar for that matter, is they're going to know where I am, but the benefit is you can obliterate them before they can actually get close enough to do anything about it. Turn your radars on. To hell with the EMCON policy. It all comes down to knowing what the capabilities and limitations of your force are. Remember that 3.5 nautical mile minimum range for the RIM-8 and the RIM-2F missiles, and understanding what the capabilities of the threat are. In this scenario, the threat, well, the primary threat was the air threat from the MiG-17s, but they were only armed with 500-pound dumb bombs, and you have to get pretty close to hit the target with one of those. The other threat were the P6 torpedo boats, but they had to close to within at least 4.5 nautical miles. And then, of course, a not insignificant threat are the coastal artillery defences. But my force, specifically the 2 guided missile cruisers, the Sterret and the Oklahoma, are armed with standoff missile systems. So you're basically in a come at me bro scenario here. But you can only use those weapons if you have the radars on. So in this case it's a complete no-brainer. It's not always going to be the case, however. Generally speaking, if the threat that you're facing is completely trivial, then yeah, go ahead, turn your radars on. What's the worst that's going to happen? At the other end of the scale, if the threat is extreme, let's say for example you're playing a scenario where the opposition is maybe a Soviet guided missile cruiser battle group, you may still want to turn your radars on. So if you know that you're facing something like a Soviet missile cruiser battle group built around maybe a Slava or a Kirov, those things are armed with, amongst other things, SSN-12 supersonic surface-to-surface guided missiles. Now these things cruise at an altitude of about 50 meters, which means, even with your radars on, you're not going to detect them until they're in the terminal phase. But these things have to go up when they're launched, before they come down to sea skimming altitude. So with your radars on, there's a decent chance you'll detect them when they launch. And that will at least allow you to get your force into a missile defense state and counterfire some missiles along the bearing of attack. Also, missiles like the SSN-12, and it's not the only one, but they are very, very clever, and they will launch them in huge salvos, and what will happen is that all but one of the missiles will drop down to sea skimming altitude, 50 meters, and one of them will stay up with its radar on, providing targeting information for all of the others. Now you won't detect the ones down at sea skimming altitude, but you will detect the one up top. You'll see that one coming from much, much further away, and that gives you the opportunity to shoot it down. Now, it's not all good news, because under those circumstances, what will happen is one of the sea-skimming missiles will then take over, will climb up to altitude and take over the job of providing targeting information for all the others. That's the bad news. The good news is that you will still see at least one missile, which will give you an idea of where the others are. They won't be too far away, and you can then engage that one missile. Hopefully, you can repeat this often enough to take care of all of them before they actually get to within close enough range that you suddenly start relying on your close-in weapon systems. The point, though, is that you wouldn't be able to do any of this unless you turn your radars on. And you don't even have to turn all of your radars on. In fact, unless you're facing a threat that's as trivial as this, it's actually a pretty bad idea to turn all of your radars on, because you do at least want to keep the opponent guessing somewhat. This is what radar pickets are for. This is why we have things like airborne early warning aircraft. If you're not lucky enough to actually have air cover, then launch a helicopter. Send the helicopter a good distance away from the force and then have it turn its surface search radar on. This is something that I've done in previous scenarios very, very successfully. The opposition will be aware that somebody's just turned a radar on, and they'll probably be able to identify it as a helicopter-based surface search radar, but that doesn't mean they know where the rest of your force are. And that one lone airborne radar could be enough to give you warning of something nasty coming your way. For example, here I've sent the Sterret's helicopter out as a radar picket, and it's picked up a whole bunch of unidentified contacts with its surface search radar. None of them are doing more than 4 knots, however, so I'm reasonably sure that none of these are hostile. They're probably just fishing boats, which is fine. The point here is that while there is a very, very strong argument in favour of maintaining EMCON and keeping all of your radars off, there's an equally strong argument for doing the opposite, or at least turning some of your radars on. Depends on who's listening. Basically, it's a cost-benefit analysis. As long as you are aware of the abilities and limitations of the force under your command, and you have an equally good understanding of the abilities and limitations of the threat that you're facing, then you can make that judgment call. Unfortunately, there is no simple, you must always do this, and you must never do that when it comes to emission control. Every situation is unique. The threat that you're facing is not always going to be the same. It's going to have different capabilities. The forces under your command is not always going to be the same. It's going to have different capabilities and limitations. The rules of engagement are not always going to be the same. It might be nice and simple. Your mission objective might be to get from point A to point B without ever being detected, but that's going to be a pretty boring scenario, and it's rarely ever going to be that straightforward. But that's why they pay you the big bucks. You're the one who gets to sit in the big seat. You're the one who has the personal steward who brings you tea and sandwiches on the bridge, because you're the one who has to make those decisions. Have fun with that. Nobody said it was going to be easy. And there we go, objective complete. And this time, didn't even get the paintwork scratched on any of the forces under my command, because I ignored the EMCON policy, and I did what the situation actually required. Hope you all enjoyed it. Hope you all learned something from it. Hope you're all having a great weekend, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.